Welcome, everybody. I'm Peter Berkowitz, and on behalf of the Hoover Institution, really delighted that you've all come to join in this conversation about this terrific new book, Safe Passages, by my friend and colleague, Kori Schake. Before I say any more, though, I should say I say that colleague with a certain bittersweetness because it is the great good fortune of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, probably the premier institution for the study of national security, that on February 1st, Kori Schake is going to become its deputy director. This is a huge gain for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I want to say congratulations. And it's a huge loss for the Hoover Institution. Nevertheless, we wish Kori well, and we think it's great for the community of people around the world who study these matters.
Thank you, my friend.
Nice. Many of you are already familiar with Kori and her work, but I should nevertheless remind you that in addition to Safe Passage, she's edited a book called Warriors and Citizens with Jim Mattis, yes, Secretary of Defense James Mattis. She's written a book called State of Disrepair, about what's wrong with the State Department and what can be done to fix it. Kori is a contributing editor at The Atlantic. She writes prolifically for Foreign Policy and at the blog War on the Rocks. She lectures around the world wherever intelligent people gather to discuss foreign affairs and national security. She's an outstanding teacher. I guess I first met Kori a while back when you were still teaching an honor seminar in strategy at West Point. I had the good fortune then to meet several of her admiring students. And now Kori teaches a popular class at Stanford called Thinking About War. A fit subject for a book someday, maybe. And what else? And actually, unlike so many people who write about these subjects, Kori has actually held a number of high-level positions in government in the fields of foreign affairs, national security, and the Defense Department. She worked in the Office of the Secretary and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the White House during war years, 2001, 2, 3, up until 2005. Worked on the National Security Council in the Bush White House, and then she went on to work in the State Department on the policy planning staff. I'm confident I've left out important dimensions of Kori's life, but I'll leave the discussion of the Vogue article for another time. You like that? No? In any case, here we are gathered to discuss Safe Passage. This book has a strong thesis. The thesis of the book is that the transition from British to American hegemony is a special case. Unlike the other cases, maybe even all the other cases, of a rising power replacing an established hegemon. In the case of the transition of power from Britain to the United States, the transition took place through cooperation and non-violently. So the big questions for Kori, questions she herself formulates right at the very beginning of the book, are: why did matters unfold this way? And what lessons can we learn? But before we give Kori a chance to answer those questions, to set the stage, to give us a account of the book, I wanted to ask her how it came to be that this remarkable painting, Columbia's Easter Bonnet, came to grace the front cover of her book. Kori, thanks for being here.
Thank you, my friend. It's a great pleasure to be here. The only weird experience I had with Harvard was actually about the cover of the book, because I had found in my research, that that particular cartoon, it was the cover of a British political magazine called Punch, not long after the Spanish-American War. And I think it's a terrific visualization of the experience for Britain of a rising United States. Because as you can see, she's a young woman confidently assessing her appearance in the mirror. She's wearing a battleship hat, which is exuding expansion, and the ship is christened World Domination. She literally has the accoutrements of war hanging off of her purse strings, in addition to the globe. And I loved it so much. So I sent it to Harvard when I sent them the manuscript and said, I don't know if you guys are looking for cover, but if you are, this is one I frequently use. And what the book designer sent me back, I think I'm not a person easy to shock or scandalize. John Hill and you can vouch for that. But what they sent me back was genuinely shocking. It was like a 1920s burlesque photo of a naked woman. And the title of the book is Safe Passage, right? And in what they sent, she's naked and she's holding like a New Zealand and American flag, and they cross right at the base of her hips. And
wow.
And I wrote back and said, I can't have you guys publish the book if this is the cover. Like, if I were reviewing this book, there is no way I would be able to avoid using that as the leitmotif for the review of the book. And 20 seconds later, they sent me this back. So it was clearly an internal conversation at the publishing house that I wasn't privy to. But it's a good cover, right? It brings the argument to life.
I think it's spectacular. So I should have mentioned that I'm going to start off the conversation with Kori, but we very much intend to keep time for questions from you all, for our distinguished author. But now let's just go to maybe the background or the prehistory of the book. To what extent did this book grow out of concerns that you've developed over the years in participating in government, commenting on foreign affairs? Were there particular conversation, discussions, controversies that you were especially responding to?
Yeah, the conversation about the rise of China and what does it mean for the United States and can it happen peacefully? There's a terrific book written on the subject by Aaron Friedberg called Weary Titan. And what I noticed reading Aaron's book was that as I started to do the research, he looks at a narrow 10-year time frame, the immediate 1890s, where the United States and Britain make a series of choices. And he ascribes to Britain as elements of a declining power, behaviors that I thought I saw over the entirety of their time as the dominant power in the order. And so it got me thinking about how does this happen peacefully? What was it about one or both of these countries, or how the international order was changing, that made this the only peaceful transition in history, right? Every other transition happens by violence. You have a dominant power, the rule giver, an enforcer of the order, who gets challenged either by rising power or a collection of other powers to be able to reset the rules. And so I chose to look at when does the United States start challenging the rules that Britain had established? And why does that work out so differently in an Anglo-American context than it turns out in an Anglo-German context, in any other transition you can think of? And I didn't know the answer to the question. So I had to learn a bunch of 19th century history.
Did you go in, you didn't know the answer to the question, but did you have a kind of working hypothesis that either that was overturned at the beginning or it was refined as you proceeded with the historical research?
Wow, that's a good question I should know the answer to. No, I actually knew so little about the subject that I did not realize that the Anglo-American transition was the only peaceful one. I thought I was going to be looking at a whole series of transitions and what made this one peaceful, what made that one peaceful, and And as Peter knows, I'm poorly trained in a variety of disciplines. And so I thought I was going to be able to be a political scientist and say, oh, here are the 7 cases. But there's only one case. So I had to rely on my poor training as a historian to be able to look intensively at this one transition and say, what was it that made this so unique?
So at some point you must have had a kind of eureka moment. That is, you were doing due diligence, you were looking for all the cases of peaceful transition. First a moment of despair, there are none
It's a bad
others.
data set.
And then suddenly you realize you've struck gold.
I really struggled to figure out where to start the book and where to end the book. And originally I wanted to start with Andrew Jackson, right? Because I wasn't just looking for the transition. I was looking for when does the U.S. try and change the rules, right? Because that's what a hegemon does. They're the rule setter and the enforcer. So the Revolutionary War isn't the place to start because what American colonists were asking for was for Britain to just apply the rules, right? To treat taxation with representation was what we wanted. And then I thought the War of 1812 isn't the right place to start because, again, we're just asking them to enforce the rules they had established. It's not until the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 that the U.S. tries to stipulate a different set of rules for the order. And so the examples that I chose in the book are not just moments of potential conflict. They're moments where the United States tries to stipulate a different set of rules, and Britain has a choice to make about those reactions. So the establishment of the Monroe Doctrine, which probably all of you know, but I did not when I started writing this book, was actually a British proposal for us to do together with the British to prevent continental Europeans from taking advantage of the corrosion of the Portuguese and Spanish empires in the Americas. So we respond to this very generous offer from the British by saying that you guys are actually not worthy of association with us, that we're a different kind of power. And so the conversation across the 19th century is a conversation where the British are trying to make a judgment about whether we are trustable as a traditional great power as our power is growing. And the answer keeps being no, up until about the 1870s, which is when I think the U.S., because of the experience of westward expansion, right, the Indian Wars and Manifest Destiny, we come to think of ourselves in imperial terms. And the British in this same time period, as Ted knows so well because I learned so much of it from him, the British democratized during that period. You get the expansion of the franchise by peaceful means in Britain. And so we come by the late 1870s to look similar to each other and different from everybody else. And that sense of similarity, which isn't racial at the start of it. It takes on racialized elements subsequently, but it's a much more complicated process than that. The sense of similarity buys the space for policy compromise in crisis. And that's why it happens peacefully.
Britain becomes more democratic, we become more expansionist imperial, but we're still both speaking more or less the same language, same commitment to freedom. So what about, could you take us through, you discuss 9 case studies. Not asking you to take us through 9 of them, but another example beyond the Monroe Doctrine of how United States and Britain negotiate, what you specifically focus on, the transition of power to make rules and the transition of power to enforce rules.
So I'll give you my favorite example from the book, which is so obscure. It's the Venezuelan debt crisis of 1895. And that actually is the fulcrum of change. And it's so crazy that that's the moment of transition because, you know, the Monroe Doctrine had been settled American policy for 70 years by that point in time. You have an obscure, completely unworthy government, right? The caudillo running Venezuela, who defaults on his debts, and the British do a little gunboat diplomacy, which was standard practice at the time. And on advice of an American lobbyist, the government of Venezuela calls us out to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And Grover Cleveland, the Democratic president of the United States, who was himself so anti-imperialist, he would not proceed with the accession of Hawaii, right? The paperwork had been submitted to the Congress by his predecessor. Grover Cleveland pulled it back because he thought it was an unfair imposition on the people of Hawaii, right? He says of the Monroe Doctrine, he finds it troublesome and would like to ignore it for as long as possible. And he becomes the first American president to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Right? It's so odd. But the British land Marines at the port of Corinto and seize the customs duties, which again is perfectly standard practice by great powers of the time. It's the first time Cleveland gets pulled into this process. He wants, it's always the first resort of American presidents, right? Like he encourages arbitration by a neutral third party. And the British toss that off. An American Secretary of State, unsupervised, near as I can tell, by the president, fires off, Secretary Olney fires off what the British term Olney's 12-inch gun. Right. It's a 12,000-word manifesto about why the British should get out of the Americas. And it ends by saying, America's fiat is law upon this continent. Right? The British write back pointing out that they actually control more territory on the American continent than the United States does. And they're not standing for this nonsense. And it's actually this dispute about stature, about being taken seriously, about is what pulls Grover Cleveland in to think, by God, the Monroe Doctrine settled American policy. He totally recklessly challenges the United States on the policy. Grover Cleveland goes to Congress and gets a unanimous support for going to war with Britain, a unanimous congressional resolution in support of his policy to fight the strongest maritime power in the international order. This has gotten completely out of hand. And the only reason it settles down is because this sense of sameness had perked past governments to societies by that point. So 354 members of the British Parliament write a letter to their American counterparts asking for arbitration of this dispute. American newspapers start encouraging the British to write letters of transatlantic solidarity. And one gets written by the Prince of Wales, the husband of Queen Victoria. And so you get, so the British Prime Minister at the start of this confrontation, right, reminds the United States that Britain controls more territory on the American continents than the United States does. 6 months later, the Prime Minister is cheered in Parliament when he says, there is no greater supporter of the Monroe Doctrine than Her Majesty's government. It's a really striking flip in attitudes that is made possible by civic engagement, by the growing together of the two societies. So you have space for policy compromise because of the sense of sameness. And it is also the first moment when the U.S. enforces the Monroe Doctrine, and we enforce it on Britain, not anybody else. And coming out of that crisis come the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty on Arbitration and the establishment of a court of arbitration in The Hague, because the British don't want this reckless American body politic to rear up on its hind legs like this ever again.
But of course, this leads into another point you make. So a consequence, another, of this confrontation is the development of an international order based upon liberal principles. So I want to follow up on that. Everybody knows that the Bush administration invented the idea of transforming the international order by promoting freedom and democracy in other states. Everybody knows that. But you say something different. You say, as this transition of power is taking place, America develops a new kind of strategy, a strategy that you say differs from the British strategy. You say, if I read you correctly, it's part and parcel of America's strategy as hegemon to transform the international order, to fortify the international by changing the composition of domestic power abroad?
Yeah.
Where do you see that? How could that be?
So if you think about, the beautiful thing that I realized writing this book was that what is different about the United States as a great power from other previous great powers is that as we grow stronger, we grow more liberal. And so if you think about Woodrow Wilson making a choice about committing American power to fight World War I, right? The terms of the agreement for Wilson, the way you get Americans to agree to care about what's happening in the world is values, right? It's hard to get Americans to care about great power politics. It's not that hard to get Americans to care about shaping the world in our image. And so across the 20th century, you see the United States as a rising power make our participation in the order contingent on the order becoming more and more a macrocosm of our domestic political order. So you see the Wilson's 14 points about the American involvement and then the Versailles Treaty, and that's not good enough to get Americans to care. But then after World War II, when we are dominant, we create an operating system for the international order that prejudices self-determination, it prejudices free markets, it prejudices cooperation as the means of solving problems, it provides security guarantees that defang a lot of the regional conflicts. And that's the price that's the sticker price it takes to get Americans to care enough about the international order.
I hesitate to take us in the direction of high academic scholarship on these matters, but you do make a point in your book that that your focus on political culture, in this case the political culture of freedom and equality, not only has implications for foreign policy, but in places you come close to suggesting it's a driver. And this, if I understand correctly, distinguishes your approach from other approaches in the university world.
So there's a branch of political science called constructivism that is one of the only parts of political science that treats the sense of national identity as malleable, right? So Germany in 2017 isn't the Germany of 1950, and it's certainly not the Germany of 1930. And constructivism looks at how changing sense of identity creates opportunities and vulnerabilities for states over time. And it struck me that the case of the transition from British to American hegemony doesn't work peacefully without this sense of changing national identity that come into alignment with each other. And so what makes me so skeptical that if this China continues to rise without liberalizing, that the transition will be peaceful, is because this sense of sameness that emerges in the 1870s between Britain and the United States, that's partly the result of revivalist religious experience. It's partly the result of the end of slavery in the United States. It's partly the result of huge numbers of immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, and England, and Wales coming to the United States. It's a complicated dynamic, but the sense of sameness, the place that it place that it came through most interestingly was actually travel writers, right? If you look at British travel writers coming to the United States, Charles Dickens, when he comes to the United States, describes America as more barbaric than the Indian cultures it subdues. Right? A British historian from the 1850s describes the Americans as a people too extreme in religion or politics to live peacefully anywhere else. And it's not only kind of true of us in the 1850s, it's still kind of true of us, right? The risk tolerance, the crazy tumultuousness of American politics that others don't newly look at with revulsion. Like, it's characteristic of how we look to others. And so in some ways, the tranquility of the 1945 to 1990 experience is the anomaly.
It's the anomaly. But so at the end of the day, and this comes out in the examples and the more than 100 years you examine, 1823 Monroe Doctrine to World War II, at the end of the day, we're still both speaking the language of liberty. It sounds like that enables us to, for all the differences, to understand one another better.
Yeah. So the reason the Monroe Doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine is the starting example, is that the British propose us doing it jointly, because they want to associate themselves with America's advancement of liberty. They're really worried that Britain is going to be seen as old Europe, and the United States is going to be seen as reshaping the international order in a way that advances human dignity and advances human liberty. So that's why they want to make the Atlantic narrower and the Channel wider in 1923, because American soft power is so much about liberty.
You told us early on in this conversation that in a way the book began with reflections on the rise of China. And as it happens, your book ends with reflections on the rise of China. And you use your historical study to illuminate the situation the United States confronts and to help us think better about the significance of a rise in China that could become a hegemon that takes the United States' place. Can you discuss a bit now lessons learned from your historical study?
So I hesitate to offer a view with not only actual China specialists, but also dangerously Eric Edelman in the...
Kori, it's too late. They're out there.
But here's what I think. I think it is extremely unlikely that if this China continues to rise without liberalizing, that a transition between American dominance and Chinese dominance could happen peacefully. But I am skeptical that this China can continue to rise without liberalizing. So it's not a dour end to the book. I actually think the domestic pressures on China are enormous and will grow, because I still think Frank Fukuyama's right? Like, I realize it's really unstylish to support the argument he makes in The End of History, but I still think he's right? That it is human nature to grow more demanding as your basic needs get met, to become more demanding political consumers as your basic economic needs are met. And I just don't see why China will be an exemption to the law of gravity. That I actually think moms demanding safe baby milk is what's going to liberalize China or bring this government down.
So I understand better now. It's really a two-part conclusion. if China supplants the United States, we should not expect this to happen cooperatively and peacefully. But there's reason to be skeptical that an authoritarian China will supplant the United States. And that's for the kinds of reasons that Fukuyama and some guy named Hegel before him set forth.
You know, as somebody who lives in Silicon Valley, right, like what the Chinese want is to create an economic powerhouse, this ecosystem of innovation and efficient allocation of capital. And that's magically going to happen without the tiresome lefties and libertarians who populate Silicon Valley. And I just don't think it's possible that people who are creative are not going to also be demanding and are not going to also be distrustful of their government, right? Because that's who those people are. And China, so Peter, actually, you're to blame for this.
No doubt, no doubt.
You and I were on a trip in the Gulf.
I remember, March 2009.
In 2009, and you asked me the question of what population size would it take to create a university of the exquisiteness of Stanford? Or what population base would it take to create Silicon Valley? And of course, the answer is the entire population of the world, right? And until an Argentinian computer programmer who doesn't want to live in Buenos Aires decides Beijing is my place, that's where my kids are going to grow up and run the world from. Maybe 1 billion people is a big enough pool to produce that, but I doubt it. And so our challenge as Americans is how do we keep the golden egg that the goose has laid for us in terms of the rule of law, in terms of attractiveness of our model, in terms of the magnetism that immigration provides the world's most talented people to us. A rising China is not going to destroy American hegemony. America is going to destroy American hegemony.
Say more about that. How do we destroy American hegemony? The danger arises from within?
Yeah, right? What's Toynbee's great line? That great powers don't die by homicide, they die by suicide. That we very often underestimate how much we get right in terms of the magnetism of our soft power. Like the dirty little secret of American hegemony is that we very seldom actually have to enforce it. And if we had to enforce it, my mom probably wouldn't stand for the sticker price setting, right? But talent comes to us because of who we are as a political culture, because of how we value liberty, because we think the government ought to stay out of everybody's business unless you give us a good reason not to. And we ought to actually be true to those things that make us who we are. So this is Shaki's theory of grand strategy.
Yes.
You cannot have a grand strategy inconsistent with who you are as a political culture. But we try it from time to time.
So this is terrific. There are several controversial propositions you've been expounding. Therefore, I would like to pursue them for one more moment. Then we'll open up to questions. One, did I understand you correctly? So you side with those who suppose that in China, economic liberalization will indeed generate political liberalization, even in the
It's a great political science test, right? Because there is no country that has succeeded in becoming sustainably prosperous while remaining politically illiberal, except China. Singapore maybe. Is the model scalable? Is the model sustainable after the founders of the independence movement passed from the scene? It doesn't look like it to me. So China's the great test case. And I just don't see how somebody who is creative enough to carry the Chinese economy through the middle income trap doesn't also think, I'm better than my government. Why am I working for them? Why aren't they working for me?
Okay, two more quick follow-ups then. So you are also then of the opinion, you propose this toward the end of the book, that free people in a free market, these are the real bases of political power and enduring political power and prosperity?
So as you know better than I, Peter, as a philosopher and student of...
No more mudslinging.
That what free societies have right is that they're more resilient, they're less brittle, because the loud contention of us fighting our way through all of our problems is very often disgraceful to watch. But what it does is provide all sorts of information and a political system that is malleable enough that people competing for power compete to solve problems as they emerge, right? We're in the midst of the great example of it once again, right? What did President Trump do? He very rightly identified an underserved community that felt like political elites weren't listening to their problems and capitalized on that to build a winning coalition. It doesn't look to me like his policies are likely to solve their problems, which means it's a competitive environment. Whoever figures out how to turn the key in the lock and help Americans who are fearful about the way the economy is changing and the country is changing to see a path to a place they're happy about and can build a majority on that basis is going to lock in the elections. And that's the resilience and the malleability. The other example that always occurs to me is that you can't be Moroccan French. You can't be Indo-Chinese, right? Because those are exclusive identities. What the United States gets right, which we very often argue about ourselves, is you can be an Irish American. You can be Mexican American. We make it possible for people to have different identities, right? If you think about the way society, to talk about civil military issues for a minute.
Please.
Very often civilians, because we have such a small military, civilians want to identify being a veteran as the entirety of somebody's identity. And that's actually not the way most veterans define themselves, right? I'm a college student. I'm an Irish American. I'm a father. And the ability of our society to limber up and let people be many different things simultaneously is a huge advantage, and it builds resilience into the system because things change over time.
That is a happy note. Let me stop with my questions here. Perhaps one or two of you have questions. Please, sir. Would you? I'm sorry. Please wait till the microphone arrives. Thank you.
Yes. You made any number of really interesting points, and I just finished reading an article in the latest commentary by Hal Brands and Charles Edel that there's considerable overlap with. They argue that Russia and China are trying at this point to carve out what they call spheres of influence that constitute a challenge to. They kind of beat around the bush a little bit about American policy over the last century and a half, sort of absent-mindedly resulting in American hegemony that's been very beneficial to us and also to a whole lot of other folks. And they kind of end on a falling note where they don't really answer the questions that they pose. I was just wondering if you had read that article and what your reaction to it might be.
So I love both those guys. I think they're serious and smart and likelier to be right than I am likely to be right on these big questions. They're both incredibly serious-minded about the big muscle movements of grand strategy. I think the question about American policy towards Russia, and I see Jim Goldgeier here, so correct me where I am wrong, because you are the most knowledgeable person about this. The flip side of the coin, right, what the Russians are saying is, you guys had a Monroe Doctrine that gave you a sphere of influence. That's all we're trying to do, and therefore you should support it. But what's different, both about the Monroe Doctrine and about the way America has consolidated our alliances in Europe to incorporate countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact. The difference is that there are political foundations and free choice associated with it, right? We wanted to consolidate liberty in the Americas, not to permit colonization. And in fact, what the Russians are trying to do is say, it doesn't matter what Lithuania wants. We're the more powerful country in the region, therefore we should be able to set the rules. And what we're saying is, no, the operating system is countries get to choose their political affiliations, and they get to choose their alliance relationships. And we're willing to underwrite that rule with our power everywhere. And part of the reason the American order is both so attractive and so cheap to sustain is because we legitimate our power by limiting it through institutions, through giving weak powers a vote on the rules, right? Like, anybody know what the senior ranking officer in the Lithuanian military is? He is a lieutenant colonel. He commands a battalion, right? So the last 3 units that General McGee commanded could conquer that country all by themselves. But we don't, right? And we legitimate American power in Europe by giving Luxembourg a vote over what we are doing. We build consensus on it. That's what the Russians are failing to do. And that's why a Russian or Chinese strategy built on that, on the macrocosm of their domestic order, which is fundamentally undemocratic, is going to be a lot more expensive for them to sustain than our order has been for us to sustain. We have an asymmetric advantage because of the attractiveness of our model.
And also, please identify yourself.
Yeah, Nicholas Romero, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I have kind of 2 questions, both related to China. One is I disagree with the premise that they've liberalized economically. And I think Richard McGregor and some other sinologists would suggest that the party, the Communist Party, is completely infused in all the larger, most important industries in China. So the economic liberalization piece is arguable.
Okay, so I will cede you that point by saying they have liberalized relative to where they were in 1970. They are not a liberal economy. I cede you the argument.
Roger, thank you. Second question is, did you see in the transition, the power transition, again, related to China, any sort of partnership developing as a result of coalitions of the willing related to, say, the Arrow War, or the Taiping Rebellion, or other instances where the British and the Americans combined to repel Chinese nationalist and militant uprisings?
So I am going to punt that one to Misha Oslin, who actually wrote a brilliant book on this subject. I did not look at these powers dealing with China other than looking at the Washington Naval Accords in 1923 that were trying to level out competition in Asia. So I didn't look enough about that to give an answer. The guy who can answer your question is sitting 2 rows back and to the left.
Henry Hedger, retired government. I just happened to be looking at the index of your book, and I noticed there's no mention of Maximilian, the Emperor of Mexico, and the intervention there by the European power, also France in conjunction with him. You mentioned Grover Cleveland, the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine due to Britain's involvement in Venezuela, but this is years earlier. I don't know if they ever mentioned the Monroe Doctrine regarding the problem in Mexico, but perhaps Maximilian was invited in by certain members of their Congress down there in Mexico City. Maybe it's a special case, but well, in any event, he arrived there with a lot of foreign troops, and the Civil War there erupted while our Civil War was on, and President Lincoln was unable to help them. However, at the end of the war, troops were massed on the Rio Grande, and then they withdrew a bit, and then, of course, Maximilian was overthrown in a coup. Do you have any comments on this? Somehow you may have bypassed it, maybe it's of not of supreme importance.
So Mexico comes into the story in three places. The first is the chapter of the book that looks at the Oregon boundary crisis, right? Because President Polk makes the same challenge on the northern border that he makes on the southern border, right? The challenge that starts the Mexican War is Polk saying, you're not protecting American settlers against Indian depredations, therefore we need to move in and do that. The challenge he makes to the British in the Oregon Territory on the northern border is, because you are not a democratic government, you have no right to represent the people living there. And it's weird that he makes both challenges simultaneously, because it allows the British to put us into the trap we put them into with the War of 1812, which is, if you're actually going to fight this, you're going to have to fight on two unconnected theaters, which we lacked the military ability to do at that time. The second place where it comes in, where Mexico comes into the story, is over during the example of the Civil War, which is, why don't the British recognize the Confederacy during the Civil War? And Prime Minister Palmerston, I think he was writing to Queen Victoria, I'm not sure on the recipient of the letter, where he says, if Maximilian can get a foothold in Mexico and the United States can be severed in two, there is no circumstance in the Americas that better suits Britain's interests. So he's enthusiastic about that. And what the United States does is counter by a challenge that if the British horse around either with the Confederacy or with Mexico, that we will begin to stir insurrection in Ireland and Scotland. So one of the beautiful things about who we are as an immigrant country is that it gives us the asymmetric ability to play in other people's domestic politics. And one of the most beautiful things I learned when I was working on the book is that, you know, we tend to think of our polyglot ethnicity as a risk in warfare, right? Think about the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. But what happens during the American Civil War is we're able to capitalize on that in a positive way and use it as a way to constrain the strongest power in the international order. Because by 1860, the vast majority of immigrants from Britain to the United States were from Ireland and Scotland to the industrial north. And so their family connections give us the ability to make this something Palmerston was genuinely worried about. And it constrained his freedom of action with regard to recognizing the Confederacy. And of course, the third place it comes up is in the decisions about World War I. But I'll spare you that one since you obviously know it so well.
Michael.
Thank you. I'm Michael Mandelbaum. Thank you for that presentation. I look forward to reading the book. I take it from your presentation that your argument is that there was convergence, political and cultural convergence, and that made the transition a lot easier. Just off the top of my head, I can think of three divergences between the two countries in the 19th century. One being the fact that American nationalism, when it began, was really anti-British nationalism, and the two first warrior generals who became president did so because they defeated the British, or at least fought the British. Second is empire, and the third is free trade, because just when the British were becoming the apostles of free trade, the United States was becoming protectionist, or at least maybe a decade later. So I'd like to ask you whether those issues witnessed some convergence as the 19th century went on, or alternatively, did they turn out not to be important enough to keep the two countries apart, or something else?
It's a fantastic question. So the first two do exhibit convergence. The third does not, but we force the change. So American nationalism, what we look like to the British in 1823 is everything they feared democracy becoming in their own country, right? Reckless demagogues. They describe us as demagogues and non-entities, right? That's their description of Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, for that matter. So the British are really nervous about what the United States represents politically, and the exuberant, what they're afraid of is what we love about ourselves, right? And that does attenuate. There's a chapter in the book that's not about a particular crisis. It's about the creation of national mythology in the 1870s, right? For the United States, the story is about manifest destiny and the rugged individualism that conquers the West, right? That's what we embrace about ourselves. For the British, it's peaceful change. It's that they're not the French Revolution. It's the gentle expansion of the franchise and absorption within the existing culture of political enfranchisement. Trade is the big outlier, and colonialism is the second, right? The British Empire and its preferential trade basis are both real frictions in the relationship, and they never get resolved. They are the changes we impose on Britain when we are strong enough to. So at Versailles, self-determination and free trade. What does FDR demand of Churchill in order to sign the Atlantic Charter, which Churchill needs to create the pretense that the United States is drawing closer and closer to involvement in World War II? That's what Churchill needs from that moment. The sticker price that FDR demands of him is signing up to the post-war international order that will be based on free trade and self-determination, right? So Britain doesn't change their attitudes about that. We force a change. And I talk about the changing American attitudes about protectionism. So the Monroe Doctrine comes up because we and the British don't want colonial power, don't want continental powers to have colonies in the Americas, because we, as the early industrializers, have all the advantage of free trade, and continental powers have closed trading systems with their colonies. So that's the genesis of the Monroe Doctrine. We and they become competitors. As I'm sure you know, Grover Cleveland in, what is it? It's 1890, Grover Cleveland's first presidency, he gives what becomes the State of the Union address that any Hoover economist's heart would run a flutter with, right? The entire thing was about free trade, that American industries are strong enough to withstand competition, that it won't result in diminished wages, that the gains from trade outweigh all of this. It's an economic tour de force and a political disaster, right? He loses the presidential election. Democrats lose 2/3 of their seats in the Congress. But then Republicans come in and try a protectionist agenda, which has the predictable economic consequences, and all of a sudden, Grover Cleveland gets reelected the next election. So we're turning keys in the lock, trying to figure out what's going to work to solve the economic malaise, and trade's a huge component of it. Trade's also a big component of why Wilson joins World War I. Right? Keeping markets open for American products is a big part of the entry into the war.
Kori, there are many people who still want to ask you
Okay,
questions.
I'm sorry, I'll be shorter.
However, I believe we're only scheduled for an hour. I think we've come to the end of our conversation, even though we've only just begun.
Excellent that
so-
it terminated before Eric Edelman could prove me wrong.
So-
I'm very glad of that.
So let me just say thank you for showing us so lucidly that the serious study of foreign affairs and national security is inseparable from also studying history, political culture, and political ideas. It was really fantastic. Thank you.